episode 26 of Getting Connected with Dr. Sharp, Connectivism and Learning in the Digital Age. Today, we've got a very special guest for you, Dr. Bell. Now, she has some different opinions about learning, and we're going to have a healthy debate on some of the learning theories that are out there. So stay tuned.
Before we hear from Dr. Bell, let's review what we know about connectivism. When Siemens presented his 2005 paper, Connectivism, a Learning Theory for the Digital Age, he positioned this theory as a way to explain some of the limitations of traditional learning theories. In the early 2000s, remember, computers started to become an integral part of learning at all levels of education and beyond, into virtual learning environments and distance education. Previous research hadn't taken into account how the use of technology would impact learning. And now, in 2026, how we live, work, communicate, and socialize are all shaped by our interaction with technology. You'll see in this diagram, we have the three basic theories that shaped education in the late 20th century. We won't go into a huge amount of detail here, but just to review for our podcast: behaviorism, cognitivism, and constructivism. You'll notice all three theories appear to address learning as it occurs within the individual. Stimuli in, behavior out. Stimuli in, processing through memory. Constructivism, it wasn't until this development of this theory we start to see an interaction with the environment. Central tenet to learning happens only with individuals and does not account for learning that happens outside the self or even within organizations. In our networked world, there's an additional conundrum. With so much knowledge rapidly developing, one of the most important skills is understanding what knowledge is really worth exploring. And these theories have limitations in supporting the need to filter what we need to pay attention to while learning. The diagram here I created to synthesize the ideas of connectivism as laid out in the work by Siemens in 2005 and the philosopher Downes in 2012. The main tenets here are: learning is active, interactive, and connected, both outside and inside the self. There are 7 principles of connectivism, and I've shifted them around here to help explain the diagram and the theory. So starting with principle 1, learning and knowledge rest in a diversity of opinions. So no longer are you receiving information from the sage on the stage, the teacher. There are many nodes of information available to the learner. This connects with principle number 2. Learning is a process of connecting specialized nodes. So as the learner interacts with the world, they start to connect nodes together. Technologies open up a vast amount of information for us outside the self, and receiving the knowledge through interaction. We derive understanding and competence from forming connections and filtering out unimportant information, which is shown here. Principle 3, the capacity to know is more crucial than what is currently known. So our capacity of the learner to use the tools to have the knowledge building, connecting to previous experience, balancing diverse opinions, and comparing recency of the knowledge that they're interacting with. Principle 4, nurturing and maintaining connections is needed to facilitate continual learning. So again, you see the arrows that this shows it's a continual process. Principle 5, the ability to see connections between fields, ideas, concepts with accurate, up-to-date knowledge. So again, this is an ongoing process. Nodes are being connected and disconnected, if you will. In principle 6, learning may reside in non-human appliances. So if we look at learning outside of the self, you have databases, and of course now machine learning and AI come into the mix, which we will get into a little bit later in the podcast. Principle 7, decision-making itself is a learning process. Choosing what to learn and interpreting incoming information as seen through the lens of shifting realities. While there may be a right answer now, it may be wrong tomorrow due to alterations in new informations the learner interacts with. I'd like to discuss two empirical connections to work that's being done in connectivism within education. The first is a highly cited empirical test case of connectivism in secondary classrooms. It was conducted by Wendy Drexler in 2010. And what was done is secondary students constructed their own personal learning environments. They used web applications, RRS feeds, digital curation tools. Students used these networks to manage independent inquiry and directed connection to external subject matter and external experts, not the teacher. What happened here was the shift of control from teacher to student ended up having some pretty powerful effects on the learning in the classroom. It was showing how students started to develop and really pay attention to digital literacy skills that were required to filter information. With groups of students started to evaluate validity of information, debates over it, and informations with peers was really important. And they started to form sort of independent learning networks that existed long after the initial sort of studies of personal learning environments. And students reported having this autonomy over their learning had a huge impact in what they were learning. The second study I'd like to discuss is it's a higher education example, and it's from 2003. Researchers Leo and Neo looked at building multimedia-based connectivist learning frameworks to focus on collaboration in university classrooms. So teacher-centered lectures were replaced by project-based connectivist environments, and students then again had to utilize digital enablers, social networks, real-world sort of industrial resource streams to co-develop their content, which was to then use to solve complex real-world problems. This framework sort of directly enhanced, the students reported anyway, that it enhanced their collaboration skills, and it optimized their integration of digital tools because they had to constantly be using them to synthesize the diverse sort of evolving information sets that they had to deal with in order to find solutions to the real world problems. So pretty powerful stuff. And that brings me to a quote from George Siemens from his work in 2005. "The pipe is more important than the content in the pipe." And this metaphor, I thought, was really sort of thought-provoking in terms of what we just learned, what's happening in classrooms in terms of connectivism, how students are navigating, connecting, and synthesizing information, and those tools needed to flourish within the 21st century, that pipe that they're building to handle all of that knowledge coming at them was really powerful. And I'm interested to hear what you think of this metaphor, or if you think there is an even more suitable metaphor for connectivism. And please write me at gettingconnected@gettingconnectedpod.ca and share with me your ideas on this quote or perhaps another. And don't forget that in the comments section of our pod, I will be placing these slides and any other information from Dr. Bell. Now, as promised, we have Dr. Bell, an accomplished professor and author. Welcome to the pod.
Thanks for having me today, Dr. Sharp. I really appreciate it.
Okay, so everyone's heard a lot from me already. So I understand that you have some pretty strong opinions and views on the limitations of our favorite theory of connectivism. So we'd love to hear your thoughts.
Okay, sounds good. I can get started. Good afternoon, Dr. Sharp. Thank you for having Thanks for having me on the podcast to discuss connectivism in education. I appreciate the information you have shared in regards to the positive impact connectivism has on education so far. However, as you know, I am not a proponent of the overuse or high reliance on technology in the classroom. I have been a big advocate for cell phone bans in schools. While I see value in the idea of people being connected and learning, there are other ways to connect than just through technology. When we're looking at connectivism through a learning theory lens, the idea that connectivism is new is actually false. The theory has already existed within other learning theories for 20 plus years. So, for example, social constructivism, activity theory, social cognitive theory, as well as constructivist theory. They all emphasize the social, situation, and relational aspects of knowledge and learning that connectivism has in it as well. Um, so, as educators, we already understand that learning doesn't happen in isolation and that there are many moving parts to learning. In addition to the fact that the ideas outlined within connectivism already exist, in some contexts and other theories, some researchers are even beginning to question if connectivism is a learning theory or a pedagogical theory. A pedagogical theory recognizes that technology is a learning tool, which everyone knows and accepts in today's day and age. However, critics, myself included, argue that it better aligns with a pedagogical theory because while learners are able to connect to learning through social networks, this learning does not exist beyond the classroom environment. For connectivism to be a learning theory, there needs to be real life learning and connections to the real world and not just the online world. Another huge criticism that I have for this with this theory is the digital divide. What I mean here is that technology is not easily accessible for all. This can be due to a variety of reasons, from financial to the location someone lives in. If we look to rural areas of this country, the internet is not always stable, especially in remote communities in the north. Internet in some of these communities can come from a cell phone tower. There are even places in Northern Ontario with no cell phone service. How do we ask youth or even adult learners who live in these areas to rely on technology for learning? While we live in an ever changing and connected world, we must also remember that not everyone is connected or wants to be connected to technology. Additionally, the digital divide also acknowledges that not everyone understands technology at a mastery level, which connectivism believes is needed in order to connect to learning and social networks. And we can already see this in education, and I've seen this in education. When I've worked in schools over the last couple of years, I've seen teachers refuse to use the smartboard and even engage with technology. I've worked with teachers who need 2 days of professional development on using Google Read and Write to support students' learning disabilities, and even then still struggle to access the technology. Additionally, as someone who does advocate for technology use with students with intensive needs, I could go on about implementing AAC programming for nonverbal students and the struggle that special education teachers and paraprofessionals have with this learning, but that's a different podcast altogether. Connectivism relies heavily on adults also being proficient in technology and to really be the masters of it. However, at this current time, I would argue that we are not masters of technology. And maybe as Gen Z and Gen Alpha make their way into the workforce, we will see that connectivism has a place. But as in present time, I don't think we are there yet in terms of navigating this divide. A final criticism for connectivism that I have is that the theory relies heavily on self-directed learning. And we know that this is not a type of learning that is suitable for all students. As teachers, we saw how well students did with self directed learning during COVID, aka they didn't do well. Yes, there were some students who thrived in this environment and have continued to thrive. However, when we look towards inclusive educational practice, access to online learning platforms is not for all. As we navigate the trend to push online learning or self directed learning post COVID, the data is showing that the majority of students who enroll in self directed learning are not successful. When we look at theories of learning in the brain, we can see that learning requires motivation. And motivation is covered in a number of learning theories. In terms of behavior based theory, motivation is seen as habits, drive, incentive, and reinforcement. However, reinforcement. However, even as adults, we struggle with learning without some kind of reinforcement, right? 10 minutes of work, 5 minutes on your phone. So I think to take motivation out of the equation and to have young students working on online and self-directed learning, we have to understand what motivates them. Additional to this, connectivism requires that learners also be able to shift through information and think critically of the information they are consuming. while traditional classroom environment would have the teacher support the learning with viewing the information in different ways and also supporting the development of media literacy. In the connectivism model, the learner is left to do that on their own. I'll leave this final thought. How do we ask youth, whose brains are still developing, to be critical thinkers? We are already seeing how AI is shifting the way we see the world and understand what is real and what is not. Even in the adults, we struggle to see the difference.
Thanks so much for those comments. You really made me think. Now let's get some questions from our viewers. The first question is for Dr. Bell. It's Susie from Ottawa. She'd like to know, why do you think it's important for educators to have an understanding of these learning theories?
I think it's important because learning theories help guide our practice as educators. I think that obviously, like I said in my discussion, education isn't a one size fits all, and we have different types of learners. So to understand our learners, we need to understand our theories. I also think that it gives us a starting point of where we can start. But most importantly, I think that we can't really, for lack of better words, sell our soul to one theory. We need to meet our students where they're at. So yeah, pick and choose from what theories you think best suits you and your learners and go from there.
Great, great. Thank you for those thoughts. So we have one more question because that's all we have time for. We've got Paul from Vancouver, and he asks, I'm a new teacher working to build my online classroom community. I have heard a lot about teachers starting to use Gen AI to support learners, and I'm wondering if anyone in the field of connectivism has looked at this yet. And then do you have any examples to share? So I was looking at this earlier, so I'll take this one for a bit, and then I'd love to hear your thoughts again. So setting up the blended online classroom is something that a lot of people have had experience doing since COVID, but now with the introduction of Gen AI, there's a few researchers looking at how it's going to affect student learning. So there's an interesting study coming out of India, actually. The Education for Information Technologies journals published a study from Miriam and here it is, Karthika from the National Institute of Technology. So they did a study looking at engineering students, about 20 engineering students, and they paired them together. And then what they wanted to see is that if they worked together using Gen AI, would it help them collaborate and be a pedagogical partner? So they looked at connectivism in terms of making connections and nodes to knowledge that they'd already made within the courses that they were working on. But they were able to use Gen AI in the sort of realm of Vygotsky. So they were looking at the AI as being that more knowledgeable other. So in the zone of proximal development, that whole work, they talked about how the more knowledgeable other being the teacher. So in this case, it's the AI. Mm-hmm. So what the students did is they used AI chatbots for scaffolding, explain it to me as though I'm a first year engineering student. They looked at it as a launch pad. So if students were stuck on a question, it would help them get unstuck. And another way they used Gen AI was to differentiate. So if the partners were having trouble with anything, they could differentiate the information that they were looking at and look at it in a different way. So, of course, there's always the dangers of losing critical consciousness. This is the idea that a lot of people are bringing about, that AI is going to start thinking for us. And what they did in this study is they used partner work to make sure that the engineering students were talking to one another, sharing their prompts, and they were very transparent with how they were using AI. So in that way, they took away that cheating idea of AI and actually using it as a critical thought partner. But what are your thoughts, Dr. Bell?
I think this is an interesting research article. I think when we're looking at the idea of AI being kind of like that critical other person in the room, I still believe that having another adult there, especially at the K-12 level, because the reality is K-12 kids aren't going to have that critical thinking piece really developed. And so I think you need the adult and not the chatbot or the AI bot there to kind of delineate that information. We really need an adult who's there to teach media literacy. How are we understanding what we're reading? How do we know if it's real? And then also there to help build that critical thinking piece. I think that at an adult level, there's definitely much more room for AI to be involved with adult learning. But at the K to 12 level, I think we really need to be cautious and remember that the kids that we're working with at that level are still developing their brain and don't have those critical thinking skills and that media literacy that an adult would have. And even in today's day and age, I would argue even some adults don't have the media literacy. If you look to social media and how AI is putting out things that look real but are actually fake and people buying into that stuff, I think we really have to work as a society and develop those skills. So definitely as this caller builds his classroom online, he needs to really consider media literacy and critical thinking skills.
That's a really good point. Having a human in the loop, and in this case, depending on the age of the students, the age of the human in the loop is going to be key there for sure. For sure. All right. Well, thanks so much for being with us, Dr. Bell. I know we've had to shorten this Q&A, but it was awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks for having me.
So for the listeners out there, we've got episode 27 coming up. It's Connectivism and Hybrid Learning in K to 12. So there we'll talk to Najir Patel. He's a coordinating principal of online learning for the Atlantic District School Board. If you have any questions at all, or if you're interested in what we learned, have any questions about what we talked about today or what we're talking about in the next podcast, please feel free to email at gettingconnected@gettingconnectedpod.ca. And as always, our episodes drop on every Wednesday at noon. So thanks so much for listening and have a great day.